leads to the tomb of Ajunta Pall, a fierce Sith Lord. According to legend, the blade proved more fearsome than the master, leading to his demise. One who has fallen so far and done so much evil does not deserve redemption. In a way, such a turning from one's nature is cowardly, a betrayal of the self.
The significance of this man's one decision cannot be overstated. It would set in motion a series of thousands of years of fighting between the Sith and Jedi forces, a conflict that would lead to not just the named major battles in history, but countless smaller machinations on every scale, from petty crime to political assassination, whole planets drowned in the misery of drug use, literal slavery working bodies to the bone, to the enslavement of the minds and souls long after those bodies died, culminating 7,000 years later with the plotting of Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious. We're able to use these generations of Sith teachings to so nearly dominate the Force itself that it had to strike back by creating the Chosen One. The Sith would force the Force itself to play a more active role in history, to go against its own rules in a way, no longer just a passive energy to be tapped into, but it asserted its will to destroy the Sith by incarnating itself in the body of the Chosen One, the slave boy Anakin on Tatooine. There were numerous Force traditions that arose over all these millennia over dozens of worlds, but the Sith would become one of the most invaluable and by far the most influential. This will be the beginning of a series that will cover all the Sith Lords in as much detail as possible, working in real-world parallels and inspirations, as well as understanding the in-universe metaphysics, as almost all Jedi and Sith are essentially warrior philosophers, who wish to understand and teach what they believe about existence in one way or another. So let's go back to more than 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. The exact date of his birth is unknown, but it must be before 7003 BBY, and this story will be going back and forth between first-hand accounts from his time and 3 millennia later during the events of the Knights of the Old Republic circa 3965 BBY.
This may very well be the tomb of Ajunta Pall.
When the Sith were at the peak of their power, going from the obscure faction created by Paul to creating a Sith empire that was often dubbed invincible, not just from their own propaganda, but from Republic experts. He was of course not the first to ever feel the pull of that mysterious evil known as the dark side. There were those of the Force Wars, the civil war among the Jedi Order between followers of the Ashla and Bogan, and later Zendor, who would be the first Darksider to wield the Force against the Jedi Order. But these movements did not have a direct lineage on the future Sith Order. Their shadows were chased away by the light. They never gave the darkness a permanent foothold. And so while not the first to be tempted by the dark side, you'll see why Ajunta Pall is considered the first Sith Lord. He was studying in the same Jedi Order that would exist unbroken up until the end of the Clone Wars. By the time he was studying the Jedi text, there was already a truly ancient history around the Order, being 17,000 years after the first Great Schism, with the fighting against those Bogan acolytes. It was once he had become a Jedi Master that Paul started turning his studies to the obscure art of alchemy. There were texts going back to before the Schism, when the Jedi Order allowed the practice of what was called the alchemy of flesh, taught in the Temple of Science. The worship of the Ashla and Bogan was in more balance then, and Enokesh could openly teach that this alchemy required leaning into the dark side of the Force, though interestingly there was some of that critiqued it even before the split. Lena Rebrock had become so adept at this art that she could genetically mutate cells in her own body, and by taking bits of flesh and blood, she could even create simple forms of life. Master Dam Pal was vocal in critiquing this as going too far, but when this was used to alter wild beasts on Tython, it was argued that the alchemy of flesh only accelerated their natural evolutionary traits. It was not any more perverse than selecting the best seeds from a vegetable crop harvest, which is a form of eugenics that almost everyone supports. Those in favor of GMOs or genetically modified organics say the form they support do not alter the structure in any negative way, and it is just the latest step in what humans have been doing since the time of dogs and corn. There are many foods that we consume that only exist because of thousands of years of selective breeding. Humanity decided that traits we do not want should be done away with, and the parts we do want should increase. In this same way, the alchemy of flesh was not seen as intrinsically evil, and we get a perfect view at how the Jedi Order, again in more balance with the Force, roughly speaking, saw the dark side as the will of the individual, and the light side as the will of the mystical source. The closest thing to creator, capital G God, that we get in Star Wars. And the skepticism of some of the Jedi toward this art is what you might see in many of the oldest religions here on Earth. A fear of what man-made items, technology, could eventually lead to. Some researchers point out that Genesis 4 can be seen as showing the tension between pastoral and agricultural life, Abel is a shepherd, not using technology to change his environment, but leading God's creations, the sheep, to other creations like the food and water, while using their wool and meat to provide for himself in a way that keeps both species flourishing. While Cain was a farmer, one who looks at a bare field or sporadic growths of food sources and thinks, I can do better, altering terrain and eventually the food itself. As the Bible says, now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Many researchers think that this overall pastoral versus agricultural theme is in response to the development of the emerging superpower equivalents in the region like Babylon, with an overall skepticism to cities and their unnatural abilities, being tech skeptical in general, stressed even more with the destruction of the Tower of Babel, which isn't so much blown up but abandoned. Quote, the Lord said, If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. I promise these are not tangents. This is really important for understanding the Sith philosophy from here on out. And we need to understand that there's also a view that makes it more like what we see these early Jedi could have been going for with the balance, seeing the Force itself like Isaiah 45:7. I form the light and create darkness, I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. And of course, with Eastern influences in general and many of the Jedi themes, but to the Force overall, I'd quote the Tao Te Ching. And while they wouldn't call themselves Jews, Christians, or Taoists, George Lucas and Joseph Campbell would say that Star Wars is just presenting the latest iteration of archetypal themes, all coming from the monomyth that is expressed across all humanity.
I had an idea of doing a modern fairy tale, stumbled across A Hero with a Thousand Faces. After reading more of Joe's books, I began to understand how I could do this. It was a great gift, and a very important moment. If I don't, it's possible that if I hadn't run across that, I would still be writing Star Wars today.
And so while Jedi were not against dabbling in the dark side, even developing technology from it, by the time of the later Jedi, we will see a strong stance against alchemy, and of course, anything associated with the dark side. Pulling on ancient themes like the Asuras as the evil counter to the Devas, like the fallen angels of the Abrahamics, and they always have these greater technological skills. The Ethiopian Orthodox are the only ones that kept the Book of Enoch in their canon. 1 Enoch 8:1 reads, And Azazel taught them to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. Samjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, Amoros the resolving of enchantments, Rakajal taught astrology, Kokabel the constellations, Ezekiel the knowledge of the clouds, Arakiel the signs of the earth, Shamsiel the signs of the sun, and Sariel the course of the moon. On Tython, all this changing of material to your will was under the temple of science, and was considered alchemy, and we get this detail that, quote, the Jedi also used alchemical metallurgy to alter weapons, both traditional and force-based tools. But there were also civilizations with a pro-tech view of the gods, and many researchers think that this divide could have been spawned by their rivalries between these factions. Those who ruled with the power of technology, like Babylon, saw it as good, and so they have the Ebkalu. In Mesopotamian mythology, the Ebkalu were demigods or sages sent by the gods to teach humans various skills, such as architecture, agriculture, and writing. They think this is good for humans, even though they agree that this is what brought about the flood, as other gods became angry with the rapidly growing human civilizations. Similarly with Prometheus in Greek mythology, they saw his stealing of fire and giving it to humanity as a great boon. It was heroic and pro-human, it's just that Zeus was not pro-human, or at least not us living outside of his natural designs. And know that might have all seemed like a rant, but I promise it will be crucial to understanding the history of the Sith that come after Ajunta Pall. And I think it's essential for understanding the worldview and metaphysical, philosophical beliefs of the Jedi, and why there's such a fear of the dark side in the Jedi Order. Perhaps an overcorrection by the Jedi, though it would be poetically reinforced at the final battle involving the Sith, the Battle of Endor, which symbolically showed how the technological, titanic forces of evil were destroyed by the simple Ewoks who lived in harmony with nature. And this dynamic would influence everything up to the memes that make fun of the seeming contradiction in the words of those like Yoda, who keep saying that they need to keep the Force in balance, when balance seems to mean thousands of Jedi can exist, but not a single Sith can be allowed. To Yoda, it's like saying that the default existence in life will have enough of the dark side seeping in. The very act of manipulating our environment according to our will is a healthy and necessary amount of the dark side. And you can also see it as just mere entropy providing enough of the dark side. Think about how it feels wrong or evil in a sense to watch animals devour each other. If humanity just had to deal with losses from animals, disease, and natural events like mudslides and forest fires, you'll lose your plants, pets, and parents, all to natural death from old age. That would be sadness enough, without all the evil that comes about from high tech and ambition, this delving too deeply into the dark side, giving us things like nuclear bombs, which could bring an end to all life in a way that none of the natural evils could. And to the Jedi's point of view, the Force is in balance just with a normal amount of dark side that comes from living your life. They know we need some tech, we will always act selfishly somewhat, it's just finding that right amount, as they would wield lightsabers, had many of the normal human flaws, even the Ewoks had tech in the form of arrows and traps. It's just not the super weapons that we'll see the Sith wield over all these millennia, of course culminating in the Death Stars. Of course, where that line is drawn is somewhat arbitrary, and I'm not saying which view is correct here. We need to remember that culture and morality are a form of tech in their own way, giving us ways to rise above some of the more brutal aspects of our nature. Maybe bombs aren't natural, but tribal warfare is, and the more intelligent animals like primates and dolphins deal out a whole lot of seemingly unnecessary cruelty. Kindness applied to things that cannot reciprocate it, whether that be a weaker tribe or some animal, is as artificial as the bomb in many ways. And we'll see later Sith that deal with the idea that the Force seems to want us to live in this, at best, semi-horrific state of nature. And the real-world religious writings were written at a time without an understanding that things in space, be they asteroids or quasars, could destroy all life on Earth without any evil human intervention. It seems to be amoral. Nothing we did, no punishment from the gods. And so we'll later see some Sith that actually go for utopia, in a strange way wanting peace throughout the galaxy, to have everyone's needs met as a way of defeating this chaotic nature of the Force. Understanding that even the sun itself will eventually die out, it would seem like the only true way to preserve life would be to have incredibly more advanced tech than the ancients or even ourselves could ever dream of. Being true shepherds of our evolutionary siblings on Earth and somehow artificially sustaining the sun, while the story of the Sith will show us many of the potential horrors of technology and ambition, we have to temper that with the truth that reaching up to the heavens is the only way to survive. Living naturally here on Earth will lead to the death of all life on Earth. So all of those themes are being played out in this struggle, from the earliest of those that were deemed to be pulling too deeply on the dark side. And Jedi Master Ajunta Pall would come to have such skills in the ancient alchemical arts that he was able to bring life to inanimate matter, some 17,000 years after Brock. Since the Force Wars, there would forever be an abandonment of the Bogan or dark side practices. The Jedi were to be strict followers of the Ashla only. And so this new alchemical threat bubbling up within their own ranks was not treated as something to be debated like the old days, but to be completely rejected. To make it worse though, Master Pall had already enticed several bright Jedi into these studies, and when they were met with the dogmatic dismissal of an entire aspect of the Force that all of their shared cultural ancestors agreed were equally important, they decided that the Jedi were the ones who had turned away from the natural will of the Force. The High Council decreed that Pall had been corrupted by the dark side, possessed by and made a pawn of that source of all evil. At this time, it seems Pall and his followers genuinely felt that the Jedi were the ones that had cut themselves off from an entire half of its existence. The High Council was deciding to define the Force in their own terms, and thus manipulate it by narrowing it down to only one form of expression. But as is so often the case in history, these dark side wielders would have an overreaction of their own, not seeming to strive for a balance any longer, but they let these feelings of betrayal, a hatred of the ignorance and arrogance of the Jedi, It all fueled a rage that flamed in their souls. And this would become perhaps the first of the Jedi High Council making self-actualizing prophecies. This reaction and demonizing of their peers did turn them into a faction that would exclusively call on the dark side of the Force. In a twisted way, they might have seen this as balance, but we see how ugly that is when the war is external, with essentially two governments embodying exclusively one worldview, one totally dedicated to the light, one totally dedicated to the dark, in a government form instead of being the struggle of balance between light and dark internally, as the ancient Jedi had originally envisioned it. Paul would lead his followers in exile to start the creation of a new nation, a theocracy with the dark side shaman as dictator. They were deemed Dark Jedi and took the name proudly, seeing themselves as heirs of the legacy of the Legion of Leto, those ancients led by Zendor in this debate that did not start with Paul, it would not end with him. This second great schism would see the fighting known as the 100 Years' War. It was intense, with each battle only pushing each side further and further into their dogma. The Jedi constructed the Prism, aka the ghost prison that was hidden in wild space, and only the High Council knew exactly where. It had elements that would help prevent the effects of powerful Force wielders, a detail which is left cryptic. The only specifics we get is that one Jedi was in charge of hundreds of Warden droids, presumably to reduce the potential of Force mind tricks and defectors to the Dark Jedi cause, just making sure that they put in charge this one highly trusted Jedi. The rejected ones would put their alchemical arts to the twisting of beings into creations like the Shamblers, Howlers, Pit Horrors, and by far the most terrible, the Leviathan. These were abominations that absorbed the midichlorian source of the living Force in their body, trapping it and not allowing it to return to the Force even in death, only when the Leviathan itself was killed. The kind of possible monstrosities the Jedi had warned about before the schism, but the united strength of the Jedi did keep the Dark Ones contained, and eventually pushed them back to the Battle of Corvos. Paul is said to have killed over a dozen Jedi before he could see that this battle was not winnable. After this war, the hundreds of Paul's followers were reduced to dozens. Specific details are a bit unclear, due to the Sith not wanting to admit perhaps the most key aspect of this story. Their existence is due to Jedi sympathy. I would argue a maladaptive, corrupted form of sympathy, which makes for a beautifully tragic story. Just as the Dark Jedi went too deep into the dark side, achieving a madness out of being driven by anger and an unhealthy will to assert themselves on others, the Jedi overcorrected and did not want to have anything in common with these evil Darksiders, so they showed too much mercy. They lost a sense of righteous anger, a sense of justice, as they would not even kill these beings that, over this war, had shown no restraint, no respect for other sentient creatures. If the Jedi had put them all to death, as they had already killed many of these Dark Jedi in the war already, and as they of course also killed all sorts of less blameworthy people, like bounty hunters and lowly thugs that turned blasters on them, those petty criminals were killed. The Jedi would kill their enemies if the blaster was pointed at them or if they were about to be struck by a saber, but just because the Dark Jedi put their weapons down, they were allowed to keep their lives. They were even allowed to keep their freedom. They were not locked away in the state-of-the-art prison or somehow kept under the supervision of the Jedi in any way. It was the worst of all options imaginable. They gave the survivors ships and supplies and sent them into exile to the furthest reaches of the galaxy to start life anew, hoping to convert them with kindness. This insanity only makes sense if you understand it as the opposite of the insanity of the Dark Jedi. It was just as unbalanced. It was absurd, toxic empathy that would cost the galaxy trillions of lives. Instead of using this moment to correct the Jedi Order once and for all, to realize that they had been struggling with a version of this dark side split for 17,000 years, and that it was always driven by fear from the Lightsiders, a groupthink reaction that only became more and more of a dogmatic overreaction, in which they rejected their own roots and their own soul, achieving none of the goals they set out on. By seeking the complete removal of the dark side, this dogma would eventually create the system that would generate Darksiders for tens of thousands of years. From Zendor to Paul, all the way to Dooku. It was the fragmented existence that inevitably led to this shadow escaping. Said succinctly by Carl Jung, quote, "The brighter the light, the darker the shadow." Joseph Campbell would take the torch from Jung and pass it on in a direct lineage to George Lucas. And I won't read them all, but if you want to pause, here are a ton of quotes from this on Lucas. All the way up to the Clone Wars show, with Lucas being especially involved in the Mortis arc, where we get the quote,
"It is only here that I can control them. A family in balance, the light and the dark. day with night. Destruction replaced by creation. Too much dark or light would be the undoing of life as you understand it.
Lucas approved this image, clearly inspired by the yin and yang of Taoism, and all the other symbols used on Mortis reinforce the balance of these two aspects. Like the Taiji 2, you can see it as a fractal, like if you zoomed in on the black or white dot, you would see another Taiji 2 emerge. The father's symbol contains the symbols of the son and daughter, the dark and light, imposed on each other all the way down. I can hear some of you thinking, but Lucas said that the dark side isn't like a tool, you can't dip into it. I get that. And there is this long quote here that you can read. Basically it's saying that the dark side really does consume you like a cancer in a host. But I think just as it was called the Temple of Science for the Jedi, it is, like Lucas said, not inherently malevolent or benevolent. It's an amoral application of the Force. Sometimes the best solution is to work in harmony with it, which we visualized or represented as the light side, but it's equally healthy and normal to assert your own will in some ways, manipulating things for the better. For others, not the self, and Zendor and Paul both seem to only be doing this before the overreaction from the Jedi. You may think that this is just the very rationalization that leads to the dark side, but I feel that the Jedi in this moment of victory on Korbos, we see the final and most powerful trick of the Evil One, the actual embodiment of the extreme end of the dark side. It creates such wretched, detestable creatures that the Lightsiders are so afraid of doing anything that might even seem similar to their actions. By being so afraid of doing anything on that continuum leading to darkness, they actually end up being an ally to the evil, a sort of toxic selflessness compared to the toxic selfishness of the dark. To the point on animals earlier, there's no toxic form of light or dark side in animals. They will never develop genocide, go too dark or too selfish, but nor will they go too light or too selfless. They'll never adopt an anti-natalist worldview where they think procreation is wrong, or think that their own species shouldn't exist. It's the thousands of years of dogmatic moralizing by the Jedi, in reaction to the first shots fired by the dark side during the Jedi Order, fear of acting like a darksider in any way, by either killing these prisoners of war or just locking them up in prison for the rest of their lives. That would be seen as too cruel, too imposing of your will over another. And so that fear of doing anything on the dark side spectrum led them playing right into the hands of evil. Again, perfectly, where these Jedi failed, the Return of the Jedi would see Yoda proven wrong.
I've come back to complete the training.
No more training do you require. Already know you that which you need. And unfortunate.
Unfortunate that I know the truth.
No. And fortunate that you rushed to face him. That incomplete was your training. Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny.
I can't kill my own father.
Then the Emperor has already won.
Yoda was the embodiment of this exact same mechanic I'm talking about. The dark side keeps playing with your ability to have balance. It always makes it so you use your past mistakes to create future mistakes. Yoda knew the Jedi history, felt it was repeated by not being shrewd and ruthless enough during the Clone Wars when it came to exposing Sidious, and thought that now it was time to be ruthless and kill Vader. He's hoping that Luke will not fall for the same mistake as the ancient Jedi in Ajunta Pall, or Mace and Sidious. They must not think twice about it and should simply kill the Sith threat. But the dark side knew the past as well. And Sidious, of course, also hoped that Luke would kill Vader. Luke does draw on the dark side in this battle.
Anger, fear, aggression. The dark side are they.
Beating his father into submission, but does not continue down this path. Despite all the debate, he does dip into the dark side, makes temporary use of it, and does not go further. Instead, he shows true balance and reasonable faith in his father, because he had evidence, he could sense that there was still good in him, and he was wise enough to know that there were no other options. Luke could not have taken on Sidious after this intense match with Vader, but the ancient Jedi Order could have asserted their will over the Dark Jedi, controlled, dominated, any other triggering, evil-sounding wording. But it's what they should have done. If the word should has any meaning at all, then the Jedi should have used this civil war to return to a more balanced approach to the Force. They should have maintained control over these fallen ones until they died, either by execution or old age. They should have prevented the Sith Order from coming about. They should have killed these dozens of traitors to save countless trillions in future generations. They could have honored these fallen ones by reforming the Jedi Order, vowing to never make this mistake again. and there would have never been the culture of dogmatic repression of the dark side that made Dooku feel like he had to seek the dark side alone, which is just what the Evil One wants, and allowed Sidious to be the only one with a true plan. Without this imbalance in the Jedi Order, there would be no vector for Sidious to manipulate Anakin with the promises of things only achievable from an entire aspect of the Force that his masters would judge you just for asking about. But it was set in motion that day. The Dark Jedi were given transport ships and were set off to the Outer Rim.
The Jedi Civil War is not the first one of its kind. Thousands of years ago, the Jedi had another civil war that split the Order. It was a terrible thing. A faction among the Jedi abandoned the teachings of the Order, following their own path. They waged war on their fellow Jedi, a war that raged across the galaxy. But these fallen Jedi were cast out, defeated, and they retreated to worlds in the Outer Rim. Over time, they took on the mantle of the Lords of the Sith, but in their hearts they never forgot the Jedi. The hatred for the Jedi Order burns in their veins like fire and echoes in their teachings.
The Exiles would travel to many worlds, eventually finding Korriban. Here they discovered a frightening-looking, war-loving alien species that had a natural affinity in the Force. We will hear a lot more from Kreia on this sort of thing when we get to her video, but species like this were a challenge to the peace and love-minded Lightsiders, who often had a bias toward cultural relativism. The Sith saw living in a constant state of warfare as perfectly normal. They would do live sacrifices of their own people and captured POWs, shedding their blood for their gods, and would drink the blood of their slain enemies. All things that the real-world Scythians, also often pronounced as Scythians, were known to do. And they and many of their descendants from this region would be some of the greatest examples of might makes right cultures, while still having a complex sense of honor and religiosity, mixed with brutal conquest and human sacrifice. There is foreshadowing here in the fact that the Sith had been suffering an ever-dwindling population, which shows that perhaps they were not always this warlike, but this warlike, sacrificing culture would end in them consuming themselves. The Dark Jedi Exiles were impressed and confused by the Sith gods that seemed to have true powers, and their highly stratified caste system used a pool of slaves to get most of the hard labor done, with the Zuguruk caste being the engineers of everything from rocky tombs to spaceships, while the Masasi were the warriors, and the Kisai, who had a profound understanding of the dark side, used it in Sith alchemy and magic in the ways that the Dark Jedi could only dream of. A whole aspect of Force-imbued objects opened up to them, with the Sith Lords relying on powerful talismans in combat. And for more clandestine killings, there was a wide array of Sith poisons. Nothing could be further from the Jedi of Ossus than the Sith of Korriban. Where the Jedi world had a much wider breadth of knowledge, this world was a living crucible of dark side energy, creating a dark side arms race for countless generations. When the Exiles arrived, the Sith tried to resist them, but when faced with this unified and unique enemy that the dark side was seeming to favor, with hopes of raising its power to create misery on a planetary level, then scale that out to the Galactic Empire, we see Paul deploying a tactic that would set the tone for future Sith relations. The Sith Lord King Grosh was powerful enough to keep the Offworlders at bay, but his shadow hand was full of those that were equally ambitious and selfish. Paul was able to trick them with the promises of great power, if they turned on their king. They delivered the king to the feet of Ajunta Pall, and he slaughtered Grosh with all the ceremony of a ritual sacrifice. To these power-worshipping aliens, this being that descended through the skies and slaughtered their king in a ritual to himself clearly must be the greatest of gods. Their priest proclaimed Paul to be the manifestation of the left-handed god Typhagem, and as one of Paul's closest disciples, Sorzu Sin, would tell us, quote, they regard Ajunta Pall as the manifestation of Typhagem, the left-handed god, and they are easily persuaded to do our bidding. Of course, her name is spelled different, but still pronounced as Sin, and the left-handed path is often referred to in occultism as the dark side. Thunderous cries erupted of Genari, which Paul would be told meant Dark Lord, and the priests continued to praise him as the Sithari, which literally only means Sith Lord, but it is connected to an ancient prophecy. The priest felt that prophecy was too sacred to write down, but Sorzu Sin was beyond that sort of thinking and records it thus, quote, the Sithari will be free of limits. The Sithari will rise the Sith from death and make them stronger than before. Ironically, Paul would reject this claim that he was the Sith's chosen one, and this title would be reasonably applied to Darth Bane, Plagueis, Sidious, and Vader. But Paul's ability to move beyond the restrictions of the Jedi meet line 1, he killed the Sith King and became their leader, which could meet line 2, but the final line would seem to be a possible connection to his alchemical ability to bring life to dead matter. But more abstractly, he took the Sith from the verge of mutual destruction, and Paul's Sith Order would take them from drowning each other in their own blood, going extinct on an obscure rock on one of the fringes of the galaxy, to eventually becoming a galactic superpower that would destroy the Jedi Temple multiple times, eventually completely scattering the Order and take over majority control of the galaxy even more times. Ajunta Pall had gone from being an ostracized Jedi, demonized for his ability to study the ancient texts, radicalized by the Civil War, and now sat on the blood-soaked throne as the Dark Lord of the Sith, focusing these people's chaotic, dark-side-fueled energy into one man's will, a vision for an empire that would embody the darkness that the light had hoped to ignore. The shadow that the Republic and Jedi had cast on the Outer Rim, growing darker and darker with each year, consolidating the historic 5 planets once dominated by King Adus. Around 27,700 BBY, Paul would move his HQ to Ziost, and we get a taste for some of the unnatural gifts of the dark side, and that he would live on for several more decades, which likely pushed his age to around 200, growing his Sith Empire before his death, and being buried in a tomb complex that would come to be known as the Valley of the Dark Lords. These same alchemical advantages allowed his consciousness to survive his bodily death, though in a way that very few would envy. Over the years, the Jedi would recount the tales of the Fallen Ones, even keeping his old Jedi saber in storage at the Great Library at Ossus. 3,000 years would go by, and fittingly, Paul's tomb was discovered by Revan, one with a similar story of a Jedi pulled to the dark side in an event that would be called the Jedi Civil War, which could have just as easily been called the Third Civil War, as we saw with Zendor and Paul, as the Jedi were still dealing with all that comes from repressing the shadow. There are many interesting details we get on his mind in final moments. One is that in this state, he had no concept of time.
Ancient. Has it been so long that you use the word ancient? I have been here so long, so lost, I cannot remember.
They are not in physical matter, not in physical space, and thus not in space-time. One of the potential answers to the mind-body problem is that the mind is in a different plane of existence, interacting or remote controlling, but not identical with the body. It's funny that the ghosts always take on a specific bodily form. You can say that it's because all your body interacts with your mind, so if I poke your pinky, you would have a reaction in the mind. It's trippy to think about, but your mental soul homunculus might not just be your body, but the shape of all things that have an impact on your mind. The largest being yourself, then your spouse and kids and parents, extended family, out to inanimate objects like homes and heirlooms. A tree burning on the other side of the world has no impact on my mind, but if the tree in my backyard was killed, I would be sad. I know it's a tangent, but when else am I going to talk about the theory on why the spirits have the same form as their body? Then there is the point that some think should be impossible, that only lightsiders can live on as Force ghosts. If you do think that, then you may believe that these are manipulations by the dark side itself. Some real-world demonologists or spiritualists, whatever you want to call them, say that all ghosts are tricksters. Some believe that because the soul must go to judgment or be in waiting, all spirits must be demons, or something trying to manipulate us. This debate has raged on amongst believers because it's so unfalsifiable, but there are powerful intellects on both sides that make reasoned arguments, and it's all based on personal testimony and emotions. People feel like it really was Grandma, not some threatening evil force, and others warn that that's no Grammy, that's a demon. You can think that's what's going on here in the tomb, even with the light side ending here. Because part of the view, even if you don't believe it, it's at least internally consistent. Some of the Christian thinkers that I've heard that believe that all ghosts are demons reason that because the ghost is saying that they are in a better place, but they died in sin, either doing it themselves or with a clear mind rejecting Christ, you get the same situation here with Paul. And you might be thinking, why would the dark side want to make it look like Paul accepted the light side in the afterlife? It could be a very clever deception, especially when you consider this is being told to Revan, who had already fallen once to the dark side, but was now on a middle path that would determine if Revan would go back into the light or dark. Maybe the dark side wants Revan to think that he can just use the dark side for good, keep that door open, and even if he falls as far as the first Sith Lord, he can just repent in the afterlife and then be accepted back into the light. Some people think that the whole Sith ghost thing is lore-breaking, but I think this explanation makes more sense, it's obviously more interesting, But we get lots of what appear like Sith ghosts in all kinds of media, even stuff that Lucas is directly involved in. So it makes more sense than ignoring all the instances we get of Sith ghosts, from Paul to Ragnos and Bane, and Yoda does seem to think that's what's going on with what appears to be Bane's ghost.
Then what stands before you?
An illusion. Real, you are not.
You do not fear me.
No. Exist, you do not anymore.
That being said, it could be that both phenomena are happening. Some Sith are so good at the art of transferring their essence into things, like Paul's sword, the alchemical expertise he was known for, and so they were able to keep their consciousness alive and bound to things, poetically creating for them a prison. And all that selfishness that drove them in life leaves them at the whim of strangers, having no physical power on the world, and just hoping to manipulate embodied beings. Because to be fair, there are a lot of things that point to this being Paul, but again, keep in your mind that the dark side knows everything that happened. We get some details on his actual death.
What is this? A spirit, full of the Force. Be careful. I sense an extremely old and confused mind behind this presence.
A Jedi here? Why have you come to this dark place, Jedi? Why disturb my sleepless rest? We destroyed each other. We desired the secrets of each other to increase our power. We battled until finally our fortress rained down on top of us.
The ancient Sith destroyed each other. The fundamental flaw in their philosophy, one would think.
I suppose that's the nature of the dark side. Power, but no longevity. Eventually it just consumes itself.
In what seems to be his feelings.
This you don't see every day. This is an old spirit full of the Force. There's such great sadness and regret. Walk carefully.
I am dead as my faith is dead, and I shall remain here, surrounded by blackness in death as in life.
In the redemption ending.
Return? But I betrayed my old masters. They would never let me return to the light side. It is too late. Too late. If I could return. Oh, my master, it has been so long, and I regret so much.
But this flash of anger and his push that you take the darkness-infused blade of Paul makes me suspicious.
Most of my brethren would desire only to take what power I have left, even if it would destroy them. I wish my sword to be taken away from here. I do not wish it to rot away as I am. I command this of you.
So he isn't worried that the sword will fall into the wrong hands. He's more worried about it rotting away. The pride that drove his own fall and the countless others since the rise of the Sith Empire. There was even a puzzle around it. If you get the wrong sword, you die. So only a 33% chance of survival, and he is fine with this. And if you do succeed, as you are leaving, he mentions pitifully that he will have to return to his darkness. All options could be seen as being in service of the dark side. If you don't care and just leave, then it's not worried that you have too much compassion. If you do seek to console this apparition, then an unorthodox position would be reinforced, that a Sith ghost could be saved even in the afterlife. And with only a few sentences, you can supposedly save the soul of Ajunta Pall, this being that wanted you to take the dark side talisman in the form of his blade, the pride of the first Sith, with the inscriptions on it that banish the light. His biggest concern is getting that into Revan's hands, to the point that there's that flash of anger when he commands you to take it. He doesn't seem like a purely repentant being to me. Though later, Kreia would believe that this is really Paul's spirit and that he had turned back to the light, while heavily critiquing this move.
Leads to the tomb of Ajunta Pall, a fierce Sith Lord. According to legend, the blade proved more fearsome than the master, leading to his demise. Ajunta's dark spectre lived on through the centuries until Revan entered the Sith Lord's tomb in search of the blade. Revan calmed the angry ghost of Ajunta Pall and showed him the path back to the light. One who has fallen so far and done so much evil does not deserve redemption. In a way, such a turning from one's nature is cowardly, a betrayal of the self. Perhaps. But redemption is a form of spiritual collapse, a fall few recover from.
Of course, she is an expert on this kind of stuff, and while I lean that what we see on the surface with this specter is what it appears like, in making this, I am more sympathetic than ever to the idea that none of the Sith ghosts we actually see are the actual individuals. It may be more coherent to see this as a trick of the dark side itself. And so, like all great stories, we are left to wonder on the message here, with a degree of uncertainty that makes this story more applicable to the real world. You may see it as beautiful that even the first Sith Lord could find peace and be embraced by the light even after bodily death, the alchemical powers of the light side proving far stronger than the dark, using Pall's own alchemical powers to defy death as the very means to give him time and opportunity for salvation, his body being crushed by the self-consuming ambitions of the Sith Lords, but his soul left to ruminate on what it all meant. Free from the chains of his flesh, his soul could choose to lay down his pride and anger and wish to be one with his old Jedi friends in the light once more, proving the benevolence and greater power of the light side. Or you may think that we must see through the illusions of the dark side, that this ending was not the cheery redemption it seemed, but all tricks from the evil one. It would worm its way into your mind and leave you with an implicit understanding that there was nothing to be feared by falling to the dark side, and even being the one to embody it in the physical world. You could see this as a horrifying example of just how sneaky and convincing the dark side was, how willing it was to use any illusion to keep you on the path toward darkness, how confidently it lied and planned long term, having no issues feeding your Jedi tendencies toward universal salvation, giving you a pat on the back saying, "Great work, and you know what, take this evil imbued sword with you." So while you are focused on how much good you did by saving a soul, the dark side knew that you had done nothing. You were only talking to evil, laughing at how uncritical you were, how easy you were to fool. It played along, planted the idea that you shouldn't be too worried about falling to the dark side, and now slipped into your inventory a possession, a sort of portal or amplifying talisman, which could be used to more effectively lead you into darkness. I think that second option makes a lot of sense, and does fit more with what we see with Yoda and Bane. But let me know what you think of all this in the comments down below. Please hit that like button, it's the best way to help me out. Comments, subscribe, shares, all that stuff is great for the algorithm. But most important of all, remember, the evil one wants you to think that you outsmarted it, and the Force will be with you, always.